In the marble corridors of Buckingham Palace, where secrets whisper through ancient walls and duty runs deeper than blood, one night would test the unbreakable bond between a royal guard and the future king. When 4-year-old Prince George's heart-wrenching sobs echoed through the palace at 3 a.m., nobody knew that a simple act of kindness would spark a controversy that would reach the highest levels of the royal family. What started as a guard's compassionate response to a crying child would soon become a story that questioned the very foundations of royal protocol, challenged centuries-old traditions, and proved that sometimes the most powerful force in any kingdom isn't authority or birthright, but the pure, unwavering loyalty of someone who truly cares. This is the true story of Marcus Thompson, a dedicated royal protection officer whose devotion to his duty would be tested in ways he never imagined, and how one sleepless night would change both his life and the future of the British monarchy forever. Marcus Thompson adjusted his black uniform one final time as he took his position outside the children's wing of Kensington Palace.
The grandfather clock in the hallway had just struck midnight, and his 12-hour shift was beginning. At 34, Marcus had been serving as a royal protection officer for 8 years, but tonight felt different somehow.
The autumn rain drummed steadily against the tall windows, creating shadows that danced across the ornate wallpaper. He had specifically requested the night watch duty in the children's wing. While other officers preferred the excitement of accompanying the senior royals to public events, Marcus found deep satisfaction in the quiet responsibility of protecting the youngest members of the family. Prince George, now 4 years old, Princess Charlotte, 2, and baby Prince Louis had become more than just his assignment over the years. They were children who deserved to sleep peacefully knowing they were safe. The palace at night was a different world entirely. During the day, it buzzed with staff, visitors, and the constant activity of royal duties. But after the sunset, it transformed into something almost magical. The historic walls seemed to breathe with centuries of stories, and Marcus often felt the weight of all those who had walked these halls before him. Kings, queens, prime ministers, and countless servants had all played their parts in the great drama of British history within these very walls. Marcus came from a working-class family in Manchester. His father had been a police officer, and his mother worked as a school secretary.
They had instilled in him a deep sense of duty and respect for service. When the opportunity arose to join the Royal Protection Unit, his parents had been incredibly proud.
His father had shaken his hand with tears in his eyes, telling him that protecting the royal family was one of the highest honors a person could have. The training had been intense. Months of physical conditioning, weapons training, emergency response protocols, and detailed studies of royal procedures and etiquette. Marcus had excelled in every area, but what set him apart was his genuine care for the people he protected. His supervisors had noticed it immediately during his evaluation period. He didn't just see the royals as assignments to be completed. He saw them as human beings deserving of the best protection possible.
Tonight, Marcus positioned himself at his usual post near the main staircase that led to the children's bedrooms. From here, he could monitor all access points to the wing while maintaining a respectful distance from the family's private areas.
The palace security system was state-of-the-art, with cameras, motion sensors, and communication links to the central command center, but Marcus believed that nothing could replace the alert eyes and quick reflexes of a dedicated officer. As he settled into his watch, Marcus reflected on the changes he had witnessed in the young prince's life.
When he first started working in the children's wing, Prince George was just learning to walk, stumbling around the nursery with that determined expression that would become his trademark. The little prince was naturally curious about everything, often trying to engage with the staff despite being gently redirected by his nannies.
Marcus remembered the first time Prince George had really noticed him. It was during a family gathering when the prince, barely 3 at the time, had wandered away from the main group and found Marcus standing at his post.
Instead of being intimidated by the tall, uniformed man, George had simply looked up and asked, "Are you the one who keeps us safe?" Marcus had knelt down to the child's level and replied, "Yes, Your Highness, that's exactly what I do."
From that moment, a special bond had begun to form between them. The other children were equally endearing in their own ways.
Princess Charlotte was already showing signs of her spirited personality, often making Marcus smile with her determination to keep up with her older brother. Baby Prince Louis was still too young for much interaction, but Marcus could see glimpses of his developing character in his expressions and the way he observed everything around him.
Working in the children's wing also meant that Marcus had witnessed many private family moments. He had seen the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge as parents, not just as public figures.
Their love for their children was evident in every interaction, and their efforts to give them as normal a childhood as possible despite their royal status was truly admirable. The Duke often played football with George in the private gardens, while the Duchess would read bedtime stories with voices for different characters that made all the children giggle. As the clock approached 1 in the morning, Marcus began his routine patrol of the wing. He moved silently through the corridors, checking each security point and ensuring all systems were functioning properly. The night nurses were settled in their quarters, ready to respond if any of the children needed attention during the night. Everything was as it should be, peaceful and secure. The rain continued its steady rhythm against the windows, and Marcus found himself thinking about his own childhood. Growing up in Manchester, he had shared a small bedroom with his younger brother. Their house had been modest but filled with love and laughter. His mother would tuck them in each night with stories about brave knights and loyal guardians who protected good people from harm. Little did he know then that he would grow up to become one of those guardians himself. Marcus had always been drawn to stories of service and protection.
As a boy, he had wanted to be a police officer like his father, then later considered joining the military. When the opportunity to work in royal protection presented itself, it felt like destiny. Here was a chance to serve his country while protecting some of its most important and vulnerable citizens. The training for royal protection had been unlike anything he had experienced before. Beyond the physical and tactical preparation, there was an entire education in royal protocol, history, and the unique challenges of protecting public figures who lived much of their lives in the public eye. Marcus had learned about the delicate balance between security and allowing the royal family to live as normally as possible. One of the most important lessons had been about discretion. Royal protection officers were privy to intimate family moments, private conversations, and personal struggles that the public would never know about. The trust placed in them was enormous, and Marcus took that responsibility seriously.
He had signed confidentiality agreements, but more importantly, he had made a personal commitment to honor the privacy and dignity of the family he served. The children's wing had its own unique security considerations.
Unlike protecting adults who understood the reasons for security measures, working with young children required a different approach entirely. The goal was to keep them safe, while allowing them to be children. They needed to feel secure and loved, not constantly aware of potential dangers. It was a delicate balance that required not just professional skill, but genuine understanding and care. Marcus checked his watch as he completed his patrol. 1:30 in the morning, and all was quiet. He returned to his post and settled in for the long hours ahead. The palace around him was settling into its deepest sleep, and he felt the familiar sense of purpose that came with the night watch. While the family slept peacefully, he would remain alert and ready. The rain began to ease, and through the tall windows, Marcus could see the lights of London in the distance. Somewhere out there, millions of people were sleeping in their own beds, protected by police officers, security guards, and others who chose to work through the night for the safety of others. It was a brotherhood of service that he was proud to be part of. As he stood in the quiet corridor, Marcus had no idea that this night would be unlike any other he had experienced in his 8 years of service. He couldn't know that in less than 2 hours his dedication and compassion would be tested in ways he had never imagined. The peaceful scene around him would soon be shattered by the sound that would change everything. The heartbroken crying of a little prince who needed more than just protection. The clock ticked steadily toward 2 o'clock, and Marcus remained at his post, vigilant and ready. In the rooms around him, the royal children slept peacefully, unaware that their guardian was about to face the greatest challenge of his career. The night was still young, and the real story was about to begin. The first sob pierced the silence at exactly 2:47 a.m. Marcus's head snapped up from where he had been reviewing security protocols on his tablet. The sound was unmistakable. A child's cry, filled with genuine distress.
It was coming from Prince George's bedroom, and within seconds, it escalated from a whimper to heartbroken wailing that echoed through the normally peaceful corridors. Marcus immediately activated his communication device to alert the night staff.
"This is Thompson in the children's wing. Prince George appears to be in distress. I'm maintaining position and monitoring." The response came quickly from the duty nurse, Maria Santos, a kind woman in her 50s, who had been caring for royal children for over a decade.
"I'm on my way," she replied, but Marcus could hear the concern in her voice. The crying continued, growing more intense with each passing minute.
It wasn't the typical fussing of a child waking from a bad dream. This was something deeper, more primal. Marcus had heard children cry many times during his service, but this sound made his chest tighten with worry. Prince George sounded completely inconsolable, as if his little heart was breaking. Maria arrived within minutes, moving swiftly but quietly down the corridor. She nodded to Marcus as she passed, her face showing the same concern he felt.
As a mother of 3 grown children herself, Maria had an instinct for understanding what children needed, and she could tell immediately that this was not a simple case of a nightmare or wanting water. From his position, Marcus could hear Maria's gentle voice attempting to comfort the prince. "It's all right, Your Highness.
You're safe. Maria is here." But the crying didn't diminish.
If anything, it seemed to intensify, punctuated by words that Marcus couldn't quite make out through the thick door and the child's sobbing. 20 minutes passed, then 30.
Other staff members had been quietly alerted, but the standard protocol was to allow the night nurse to handle the situation unless additional help was specifically requested. The crying showed no signs of stopping, and Marcus found himself fighting the urge to abandon his post and see if he could help. His training told him to maintain his position, but his heart was pulling him toward that bedroom door. At 3:15 a.m., Maria emerged from the room, looking exhausted and worried.
She approached Marcus with obvious frustration. "He won't tell me what's wrong," she whispered.
"He just keeps asking for his teddy bear, but it's right there on his bed. He's not sick, no fever, nothing physically wrong that I can determine.
But he's absolutely distraught, and nothing I've tried is helping." The crying continued, seeming to grow even more desperate. Marcus could hear it clearly now through the open door. Prince George calling out between sobs. Words that were difficult to understand, but filled with such sadness that it made Marcus's throat tighten. The little boy's voice was growing hoarse from crying, but he couldn't seem to stop.
"Should I contact the Duke and Duchess?" Maria asked, though Marcus could tell she was reluctant.
The royal couple had been attending a late formal dinner and had only returned to their private residence an hour ago. Waking them would be a last resort, but if this continued much longer, it might become necessary.
Marcus made a decision that would later be scrutinized by his superiors, debated by royal protocol experts, and ultimately change the course of his career. "Let me try," he said quietly. Sometimes children respond differently to different people. Maria looked surprised. In all her years of service, she had never heard of a protection officer becoming directly involved in childcare. It simply wasn't done. The roles were clearly defined. Officers provided security, while trained childcare staff handled all other needs. But as another wave of heartbroken sobbing came from the bedroom, she found herself nodding. "At this point, I'm willing to try anything." Marcus approached the bedroom door with a mixture of determination and nervousness. He had interacted with Prince George many times, but always in casual, brief encounters. He had never been alone with any of the royal children for an extended period, and certainly never in a situation like this.
As he entered the room, he was struck by how small and vulnerable the little prince looked in his large bed. Prince George was sitting up among his pillows, tears streaming down his face, clutching his teddy bear tightly against his chest. His hair was disheveled from tossing and turning, and his pajamas were twisted from his restless movements. When he saw Marcus enter the room, his crying didn't stop, but his eyes showed a flicker of recognition.
"Your Highness," Marcus said softly, approaching the bed slowly. "It's Marcus. You know me, I'm the one who keeps you safe, remember?" He kept his voice calm and gentle, the same tone he had used with his own nephew when comforting him after nightmares.
Prince George looked at him through his tears, his little chest still heaving with sobs. "My Teddy," he managed to say between cries.
"He's not the same. He's different." Marcus looked at the teddy bear the prince was holding.
It appeared to be the same brown bear he had seen countless times before, well-loved, with slightly matted fur and one ear that was more worn than the other. But to the 4-year-old prince, something was clearly very wrong.
"Can you tell me what's different about him?" Marcus asked, sitting carefully on the edge of the bed. This was completely against protocol. Protection officers did not sit on the beds of royal family members, but something in the child's distress told him that normal rules didn't apply to this moment. "His smell," Prince George said, his voice tiny and broken. "He doesn't smell like mummy anymore. He doesn't smell like home." The words came out in a rush between sobs, and suddenly Marcus understood. The teddy bear had been through the palace laundry system, as all the children's belongings were regularly cleaned for hygiene purposes. But for a 4-year-old boy, his teddy bear was more than just a toy. It was his source of comfort. And that comfort came not just from its presence, but from the familiar sense that made him feel safe and loved. Marcus felt his heart break a little for the young prince. Here was a child who lived in magnificent palaces, surrounded by staff dedicated to meeting his every need, but who was crying inconsolably because his teddy bear didn't smell like his mother anymore.
It was such a purely human moment of childhood vulnerability that it stripped away all the royal titles and protocol, leaving just a little boy who needed comfort.
"I understand," Marcus said gently.
"Your teddy bear is very important to you, And when he doesn't smell right, it makes you feel scared, doesn't it? Prince George nodded vigorously, his tears still flowing but his sobbing beginning to quiet slightly as he felt understood. Maria watched from the doorway, amazed at the immediate change in the prince's demeanor. In her decades of childcare experience, she recognized the skill Marcus was displaying, the ability to truly listen to a child and validate their feelings, no matter how small those concerns might seem to adults. Marcus continued talking quietly with Prince George, asking gentle questions about his teddy bear, and listening carefully to the answers. The prince explained that the teddy bear always slept with him and his parents when he had nightmares, and that it carried the scent of his mother's perfume and his father's cologne, which made him feel safe. Without those familiar smells, the bear felt like a stranger, and Prince George felt alone and frightened.
The conversation continued for nearly an hour. Marcus found himself sharing a story about his own childhood teddy bear, a raggedy elephant named Peanut, that his grandmother had made for him.
He told Prince George about how important Peanut had been to him, and how he had understood that feeling of needing something special, to feel safe and loved. Gradually, Prince George's tears began to subside. He was still sad about his teddy bear, but the fact that someone understood and cared about his problem seemed to comfort him enormously. Marcus suggested that perhaps in the morning, they could ask Mummy to hold the teddy bear for a while so it could smell like her again. This idea seemed to give the prince hope, and his breathing began to return to normal. As the clock approached 4:30 a.m., Prince George's eyelids were growing heavy.
The emotional exhaustion from crying combined with Marcus's soothing presence was finally allowing the little boy to calm down. But every time Marcus moved as if to leave, the prince would become agitated again, reaching out for him.
"Stay," Prince George whispered, his small hand grasping Marcus's larger one. "Please stay until I fall asleep." Marcus looked toward Maria, who gave him an encouraging nod. He knew this was far beyond the scope of his duties as a protection officer, but he also knew that this child needed him in this moment. Sometimes duty meant more than just following rules. Sometimes it meant being human. "Of course, Your Highness," Marcus replied softly. "I'll stay right here until you're fast asleep." Prince George settled back into his pillows, still holding his teddy bear, but now also keeping one small hand connected to Marcus's. The room grew quiet except for the gentle sound of the rain that had started again outside the windows. Marcus sat perfectly still, his heart full of tenderness for this little boy who, despite all his privileges, was still just a child who needed comfort and understanding. As Prince George finally drifted off to sleep, Marcus couldn't know that this act of compassion would soon become the subject of intense scrutiny. He couldn't foresee the meetings that would be called, the questions that would be asked, or the way this single night would test everything he believed about duty, protocol, and what it truly meant to serve and protect. All he knew in that moment was that he had helped a frightened child feel safe again, and that felt like the most important thing in the world. The first hint that something was amiss came at 7:30 a.m. when Marcus was completing his shift report. Superintendent James Crawford, the head of the Royal Protection Unit, appeared in the security office with an expression that Marcus had never seen before. A mixture of confusion, concern, and barely contained frustration. Crawford was a man in his early 60s who had dedicated his entire career to royal security, working his way up through the ranks with unwavering dedication to protocol and procedure.
"Thompson," Crawford said, his voice carefully controlled. "I need to see you in my office immediately."
Marcus followed his superior down the corridor, his stomach beginning to twist with anxiety.
He had filed his report truthfully documenting the night's events and his decision to comfort Prince George. At the time, it had seemed like the right thing to do. The only thing to do. But now, seeing Crawford's stern expression, he was beginning to realize that others might not view his actions in the same light. Crawford's office was a testament to his decades of service. The walls were lined with photographs of him alongside various members of the royal family, commendations for distinguished service, and certificates from advanced security training programs. Behind his desk hung a portrait of the Queen, whose eyes seemed to watch every conversation that took place in the room. "Sit down, Marcus," Crawford said, using his first name in a way that somehow made the situation feel even more serious. "I've received a very interesting report about last night's incident with Prince George." He had learned long ago that in situations like this, it was better to listen first and speak only when directly asked a question. Crawford picked up a file from his desk and opened it slowly. "According to your report, and corroborated by Nurse Santos, you spent approximately 2.5 hours in Prince George's bedroom last night, providing what you describe as comfort and reassurance during a period of distress."
He looked up at Marcus over his reading glasses. Is this accurate?
Yes, sir, Marcus replied steadily. Prince George was extremely upset, and traditional comfort measures weren't working.
I made a judgment call to see if I could help.
A judgment call, Crawford repeated, his tone flat.
Marcus, in your 8 years of service, have you ever received training in child psychology or pediatric care?
No, sir. Have you ever been briefed on the appropriate protocols for personal interaction with members of the royal family outside of your security duties?
Yes, sir.
I have received those briefings. Crawford leaned back in his chair, studying Marcus carefully.
Then you understand that what you did last night was completely outside the scope of your responsibilities as a protection officer. You understand that by sitting on Prince George's bed, by engaging in extended personal conversation, by remaining in his private quarters for hours without authorization, you violated virtually every protocol governing your position.
Marcus felt his chest tighten, but he maintained his composure. Yes, sir. I understand that my actions were outside normal protocol. But Prince George was in genuine distress and he needed help. Help that should have come from qualified childcare professionals, Crawford replied sharply. Help that should have come from his parents if necessary, not from a protection officer who took it upon himself to decide that he knew better than established procedures. The accusation stung, but Marcus forced himself to remain calm. Sir, with respect, Prince George specifically asked me to stay. He was frightened, and my presence seemed to comfort him. I felt that my first priority was his well-being. Crawford stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the palace grounds where early morning staff were beginning their daily routines. Marcus, do you have any idea what kind of position you've put me in? What kind of position you've put the entire Royal Protection Unit in? Marcus remained silent, sensing that this was a rhetorical question. I received a call at 6 this morning. Crawford continued, still facing the window. From the private secretary's office. Apparently, word of your intervention has already reached certain members of the royal household staff. They're asking questions, Marcus. They're asking whether our protection officers are overstepping their bounds, whether they can be trusted to maintain appropriate professional boundaries. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. The idea that his actions might have created doubt about the professionalism of his fellow officers was devastating. The Royal Protection Unit prided itself on its impeccable reputation and absolute trustworthiness. The thought that he might have damaged that reputation made him feel sick. Crawford turned back to face him. But that's not even the worst part. Do you know what the worst part is, Marcus? Marcus shook his head, not trusting himself to speak. The worst part is that you were right. The unexpected words left Marcus speechless. Crawford returned to his desk and sat down heavily, suddenly looking older than his years. I spoke to Nurse Santos this morning. She told me that in her 23 years of caring for royal children, she had never seen a child as inconsolable as Prince George was last night. She said she was genuinely worried about him, that nothing she tried was working, and that she was about to recommend waking the Duke and Duchess despite the late hour. Crawford paused, running a hand through his graying hair. She also told me that the moment you entered that room, something changed. She said she watched you connect with Prince George in a way that was both professional and genuinely caring. She said you probably prevented what could have been a much more serious situation. Marcus felt a wave of relief, but it was quickly tempered by Crawford's next words. But being right doesn't necessarily mean you did the right thing, Marcus. Protocol exists for reasons. Boundaries exist for reasons. When we start making exceptions, even for the best of intentions, we open doors that may be very difficult to close. The office fell silent except for the distant sound of traffic from the street beyond the palace walls. Marcus understood the complexity of the situation he had created. Royal protection was not just about physical security. It was about maintaining a carefully balanced system of trust, professionalism, and discretion that had been built over decades. Sir, Marcus finally spoke, his voice steady despite the turmoil he felt inside. I understand the concerns about protocol. I understand that my actions were outside normal procedures. But if the same situation happened again tonight, I would make the same choice. A frightened child needed help, and I was able to provide it. I can't regret that, even if it creates complications. Crawford studied him for a long moment, and Marcus thought he saw something like admiration flicker in the older man's eyes, before his expression became stern again. That's exactly what I was afraid you would say, Crawford replied. Marcus, your dedication is not in question. Your competence as a protection officer is not in question. But your judgment regarding appropriate boundaries clearly is. Crawford opened another file and pulled out a formal document. I'm placing you on administrative leave pending a full review of your conduct. You're to surrender your credentials and security clearances immediately.
You will not be permitted on palace grounds until this review is complete. The words felt like a punch to the stomach. Marcus had never been disciplined in his entire career, had never even received a formal reprimand.
The idea of being banned from the palace, of being unable to fulfill his duties to protect the family he had come to care about so deeply, was almost unbearable. "How long will the review take?" Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper.
That depends on several factors, Crawford replied, his tone becoming slightly more gentle. The private secretary's office will need to interview all relevant staff members. There will need to be consultations with senior members of the royal household. Your service record will be reviewed in detail. It could be weeks, possibly longer. Marcus nodded, not trusting himself to speak. 8 years of dedicated service, 8 years of perfect reviews and commendations, all now overshadowed by one night when he had chosen compassion over protocol. Crawford stood up, signaling that the meeting was over. "Marcus, I want you to understand something. Personally, I think you're a good man who made a decision based on genuine care for a child's well-being. But personally doesn't matter in this job. What matters is maintaining the trust and confidence of the royal family and the British people. That trust requires absolute adherence to established protocols, even when those protocols might seem cold or unnecessary." As Marcus prepared to leave, Crawford added one final thought.
"There is one more thing you should know. This morning when Prince George woke up, the first thing he asked his mother was whether Marcus the guardman would be there tonight to keep his teddy bear company if he got scared again."
The words hit Marcus harder than any reprimand could have.
Prince George was looking forward to seeing him again, trusting that he would be there if needed. The little boy had no understanding of protocols or professional boundaries. He only knew that someone had cared enough to stay with him when he was frightened. Marcus handed over his credentials with hands that were steadier than he felt inside. As he walked out of Crawford's office and through the palace corridors for what might be the last time, he passed the children's wing where Prince George was probably having breakfast, unaware that the man who had comforted him through the night would not be returning.
The irony was not lost on Marcus. In trying to protect Prince George from fear and sadness, he had put his own career at risk.
In choosing to be human in a job that demanded perfect professionalism, he had potentially lost the opportunity to continue serving the people he cared about most. As he reached the palace gates, Marcus looked back at the building that had been his second home for 8 years. Somewhere inside those walls, a little boy was going about his morning routine, secure in the knowledge that he was safe and protected, and perhaps, Marcus thought, that was worth whatever consequences he would have to face. The morning sun was beginning to burn off the clouds from the previous night's rain, and London was waking up to a new day. But for Marcus Thompson, everything had changed. His devotion had indeed been tested, and while he had no regrets about his choice, he was now facing the very real possibility that his career in royal protection was over. The review process would determine his future. But Marcus knew that regardless of the outcome, he had learned something important about himself that night. When faced with a choice between following rules and following his heart, he would always choose compassion. Whether that would be enough to save his career remained to be seen.
3 weeks into his suspension, Marcus was sitting in his small flat in South London, staring at the stack of newspapers on his coffee table. Somehow, word of his situation had leaked to the press, and the story had taken on a life of its own. The headlines ranged from sympathetic to sensational: Royal Guard suspended for showing kindness, Palace protocol under fire after Guard's compassionate act, and the human touch when royal rules go too far. Marcus hadn't spoken to any reporters, despite dozens of requests for interviews. He had maintained his silence out of respect for the royal family and his oath of confidentiality. But others had clearly been talking, and the story had been pieced together from various sources within the palace staff. While some details were inaccurate, the basic facts were correct enough to create a public controversy that was growing larger each day. His phone rang for the 100th time that week, but this time the caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, with a palace extension. Marcus's heart skipped as he answered, wondering if this was finally news about his review. "Mr. Thompson, this is Elizabeth Hartwell from the private secretary's office. I'm calling to request that you come to the palace tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock for a meeting." "Yes, of course," Marcus replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "May I ask what kind of meeting?" "I'm not at liberty to discuss the details over the phone, but I can tell you that several members of the royal household would like to speak with you." Marcus spent a sleepless night wondering what this meeting could mean. Was this the end of his review? Had they decided to terminate his employment? Or was there some other development he hadn't anticipated? He pressed his best uniform, polished his shoes, and prepared himself for what might be the most important conversation of his career. The next morning,
Marcus arrived at the palace feeling a mixture of nervousness and strange nostalgia. Walking through the gates he had passed through thousands of times before, felt both familiar and completely different now that he was there as a visitor rather than an officer on duty. The guards at the entrance treated him with professional courtesy, but he could see the curiosity in their eyes. Elizabeth Hartwell met him in the main reception area. She was a woman in her 40s, with an efficient manner and kind eyes who had worked in various royal household positions for over 15 years. Mr. Thompson, thank you for coming. I hope you understand that this is a rather unusual situation for all of us.
Marcus nodded. Everything about the past 3 weeks had been unusual.
She led him through corridors he knew well, but instead of heading toward the security offices, they went in the direction of the formal meeting rooms used for official royal business. Marcus's anxiety increased with each step. This was clearly not going to be a simple administrative discussion. They stopped outside a door marked Blue Drawing Room, and Elizabeth turned to him. Before we go in, I should prepare you. This meeting was requested personally by the Duchess of Cambridge. She has asked to speak with you directly about the incident with Prince George. Marcus felt his knees go weak.
In all his years of service, he had never had a formal private meeting with any senior member of the royal family. His interactions had always been professional and brief, focused on security matters rather than personal conversations.
The idea of discussing his conduct directly with Prince George's mother was both thrilling and terrifying. Elizabeth knocked softly on the door and opened it to reveal an elegantly furnished room with tall windows overlooking the palace gardens. The Duchess of Cambridge was seated at a small table, dressed in a simple blue dress that somehow managed to look both casual and regal. She looked up as they entered, and Marcus was struck by how young and approachable she seemed. Despite the formal setting,
"Your Royal Highness," Elizabeth said, "may I present Mr. Marcus Thompson?"
Marcus bowed slightly, as protocol required. "Your Royal Highness." The Duchess smiled warmly and gestured to the chair across from her. "Please, Mr. Thompson, sit down." "Thank you, Elizabeth. I'd like to speak with Mr. Thompson privately, if you don't mind." Elizabeth nodded and quietly left the room, closing the door behind her. Marcus found himself alone with the future Queen of England, feeling more nervous than he had ever felt in his life. "Would you like some tea?" the Duchess asked, and her voice was so normal, so genuinely friendly, that Marcus felt some of his tension ease. "That would be lovely, Your Royal Highness. Thank you." She poured tea for both of them from a delicate china service, and Marcus noticed that her hands were steady while his own trembled slightly as he accepted the cup. "Mr. Thompson," she began, "I asked to meet with you because I wanted to thank you personally for what you did for George that night." The words were so unexpected that Marcus nearly dropped his teacup. "Your Royal Highness," She held up a gentle hand to stop him. "Please let me finish. I know that you've been suspended, and I know that there are questions being raised about protocol and appropriate boundaries. But as a mother, I need you to understand what your actions meant to my family." The Duchess leaned forward slightly, her expression becoming more serious. "George told me all about that night. He told me how scared he was, how his teddy bear didn't smell right, and how you understood why that was so important to him. He told me how you stayed with him and told him stories about your own teddy bear until he felt safe enough to sleep." Marcus felt his throat tighten with emotion. "He's a special little boy, Your Royal Highness. He was genuinely frightened, and I just wanted to help."
"You did help," she replied firmly.
"More than you know. You see, George has been having trouble sleeping for several weeks. There have been some changes in his routine, some new people around, and he's been feeling unsettled. That night was the worst it had been, but it was also the turning point. Since then, he's been sleeping peacefully again." She paused to take a sip of her tea before continuing. "George asks about you every day. He wants to know if Marcus the guard man is coming back, if he'll be there if the teddy bear problem happens again. He doesn't understand why you haven't been around, and frankly, neither do I." The criticism in her words was gentle but unmistakable. Marcus realized that the Duchess was not just thanking him. She was questioning the decision to suspend him. "Your Royal Highness," Marcus said carefully, "I understand that my actions were outside normal protocol. I don't want to create any difficulties for the Royal Protection Unit or the household staff." The Duchess shook her head. "Mr. Thompson, my husband and I have been discussing this situation extensively. We've also been talking to other members of the family about the balance between security protocols and the human elements of the job you do." She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the gardens where Marcus had often watched Prince George play during his outdoor time.
You know, she continued, people often ask me what it's like to raise children in this environment, with all the security and protocol that surrounds our family. The truth is, it's challenging because we want our children to feel safe and loved, not like they're living under constant surveillance. She turned back to Marcus.
What you did that night, sitting with George, listening to him, understanding what he needed, that wasn't a security officer overstepping boundaries. That was a caring adult, helping a frightened child.
It's exactly the kind of human connection we want our children to experience even within the constraints of their royal life. Marcus was speechless. He had expected many possible outcomes from this meeting, but having the Duchess of Cambridge defend his actions was not one of them. Your Royal Highness, I appreciate your understanding more than I can express, but I also understand the concerns about protocol. Protocol serves a purpose, she interrupted gently, but it should never override basic human decency and care. My husband and I have made our position on this matter very clear to the appropriate officials. She returned to her seat and looked directly at Marcus. We've asked that your suspension be lifted immediately and that you be returned to your duties in the children's wing if you're willing to return. Marcus felt as though the floor had shifted beneath him. Do you mean my position is secure? More than secure, the Duchess replied with a slight smile. We've also recommended that you receive a commendation for exceptional service. What you did that night demonstrated exactly the kind of judgment and caring that we want from the people who help protect our children. The emotional weight of the past 3 weeks suddenly hit Marcus all at once. The stress, the uncertainty, the fear that his career was over, the guilt over potentially damaging his colleagues' reputations, all of it lifted in an instant, replaced by a profound sense of gratitude and relief.
I don't know what to say, Your Royal Highness.
I'm deeply honored by your confidence in me. The Duchess smiled more broadly. You don't need to say anything. Just continue being the person you were that night, someone who sees past titles and protocols to the human beings underneath. That's exactly what our children need. She stood up, indicating that the meeting was coming to an end. There is one more thing, Mr. Thompson. George has been asking when you'll be back. May I tell him that you'll be there tonight? Marcus stood as well, his heart swelling with emotion.
Yes, Your Royal Highness.
You can tell him that Marcus will be there tonight and every night that you need me to be.
As he prepared to leave, the Duchess extended her hand for a handshake, a gesture that was both formal and surprisingly personal.
Thompson, for caring about my son and for reminding all of us that sometimes the most important protocols are the ones written in our hearts, not in our procedure manuals.
As Marcus walked out of the palace, he felt as though he was floating. Not only was his career saved, but he had been personally thanked and commended by the mother of the child he had helped.
More importantly, he would be returning to a job where he could continue to serve and protect the family that had come to mean so much to him. Tonight, he would be back at his post in the children's wing, and if Prince George needed him again, Marcus would be there, ready to balance the demands of protocol with the deeper calling of compassion that had guided him through the most challenging night of his career. 6 months later, Marcus Thompson stood in the same corridor where this entire journey had begun. But everything was different now. He wore the same uniform, carried the same equipment, and maintained the same vigilant watch over the children's wing. Yet the invisible boundaries that had once defined his role had been fundamentally redrawn, not through any formal policy change, but through a deeper understanding of what true service really meant. The changes had been gradual but profound.
Word of the Duchess's intervention and support had spread throughout the Royal Protection Unit, creating ripple effects that no one had anticipated. Superintendent Crawford, initially resistant to any deviation from established protocol, had found himself having conversations with senior royal household members about the balance between security and human connection that he had never expected to have in his career.
The morning after Marcus's reinstatement, Crawford had called him into his office once again, but this time the atmosphere was completely different. The stern disapproval had been replaced by something closer to curiosity and perhaps a grudging respect. Marcus, Crawford had said, settling back in his chair with a thoughtful expression. It seems I owe you an apology, not for questioning your actions. That was my responsibility as your supervisor. But for failing to recognize that sometimes exceptional circumstances require exceptional responses. Crawford had gone on to explain that the royal family's response to the incident had prompted a comprehensive review of protection protocols, particularly those governing interactions between security personnel and the royal children. The review wasn't aimed at relaxing security measures, but at creating more flexibility for officers to respond appropriately when children were in emotional distress. The royal family has made it clear, Crawford had continued, that they value protection officers who can see beyond their security duties to the human needs of the people they serve. They want officers who can exercise judgment, show compassion, and maintain security without creating an environment that feels cold or impersonal. The new guidelines that emerged from this review were subtle but significant. Protection officers were now encouraged to engage naturally with the royal children when appropriate, to respond to obvious emotional needs, and to use their judgment in balancing protocol with compassion. Training programs were updated to include modules on child psychology and age-appropriate communication, acknowledging that protecting children required understanding them as whole human beings, not just security assignments.
Marcus had been asked to help develop some of these training materials, sharing his insights about reading children's emotional states and responding appropriately to their needs. It was work he found deeply fulfilling, knowing that future officers would be better equipped to handle situations like the one he had faced that night with Prince George.
The most rewarding changes, however, were the ones he witnessed in his daily interactions with the royal children. Prince George, now 5 years old, had developed a remarkable sense of security and trust that was evident in everything he did. The bond formed during that difficult night had evolved into a natural, comfortable relationship that enhanced rather than complicated Marcus's ability to protect him. Prince George would often stop to chat with Marcus during his daily routines, sharing stories about his school day, his siblings, or his latest interests.
These conversations never interfered with security protocols, but they provided Marcus with valuable insights into the prince's emotional state and any concerns he might have. It was a level of communication that made Marcus more effective at his job, not less.
Princess Charlotte, now 3 and displaying the spirited personality everyone had predicted, had also developed a special fondness for Marcus. She would sometimes bring him drawings she had made, or ask him to settle minor disputes with her older brother.
Baby Prince Louis, now walking and beginning to talk, would light up with recognition whenever he saw Marcus, often reaching out for him when he passed by. The other protection officers had initially watched these interactions with some skepticism, wondering if Marcus was receiving special treatment, or if the standards were being lowered for everyone.
But as time passed, they began to see the practical benefits of Marcus's approach. Children who trusted their protection officers were more cooperative during security procedures, more likely to communicate when they felt uncomfortable or unsafe, and generally easier to protect effectively.
The royal parents had also noticed the difference. The Duke and Duchess of Cambridge had both expressed their appreciation for the more natural relationship their children had developed with their security team.
They particularly valued knowing that if they were unavailable during a crisis, their children would be cared for by people who genuinely understood and cared about them as individuals. The media attention surrounding Marcus's initial suspension had eventually died down, but not before sparking a broader conversation about the modernization of royal protocols and the human side of royal protection. Editorial writers had praised the royal family's handling of the situation, noting that their response demonstrated both strong family values and intelligent adaptation to changing times. Marcus had never given any interviews about the incident, maintaining his commitment to discretion and privacy, but he had been approached by several security training organizations asking him to speak about the importance of emotional intelligence in protection work. He had accepted a few of these opportunities, always with the palace's permission, seeing them as chances to advocate for more humane approaches to security in various contexts.
On this particular evening, as Marcus settled into his night watch position, he reflected on how much had changed since that rainy night when Prince George had cried for hours over his teddy bear. The prince now slept peacefully most nights, secure in the knowledge that he was surrounded by people who truly cared about him. When he did have occasional nightmares or difficulties, he felt comfortable seeking help from the adults around him, knowing that his feelings would be taken seriously and addressed with kindness. The teddy bear incident had become something of a family legend.
The Duchess had indeed solved the original problem by holding the bear for a while so it would smell like her again. And the palace laundry staff had developed new procedures for cleaning the children's comfort items that preserved their familiar scents. It was a small change that made a big difference in Prince George's sense of security.
More importantly, the incident had taught everyone involved valuable lessons about the importance of listening to children and taking their concerns seriously, no matter how small those concerns might seem to adults.
The royal children were growing up in an environment where their emotional needs were valued alongside their physical security, where the people protecting them also cared about their happiness and well-being.
As the clock approached midnight, Marcus began his routine patrol of the children's wing. All 3 children were sleeping peacefully, their rooms quiet except for the soft sounds of regular breathing.
Prince George's room was particularly peaceful, his teddy bear still beside him on the pillow, but no longer the source of anxiety it had once been. Marcus paused for a moment outside Prince George's door.
remembering that transformative night 6 months ago. He thought about the choice he had made to follow his heart instead of the rulebook, and how that choice had led to positive changes that extended far beyond his own career. Sometimes, he realized, the most important moments in life came when you had to decide between doing what was expected and doing what was right. The palace around him hummed with its usual nighttime activity, security monitors being checked, perimeter guards making their rounds, night staff maintaining the complex systems that kept this historic building functioning. But in the children's wing, all was peaceful and secure.
3 young members of the royal family slept safely, watched over by protection officers who understood that their mission extended beyond physical security to encompass the emotional well-being of the children in their care. Marcus completed his patrol and returned to his post, settling in for another night of vigilant service. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to balance protocol with compassion, new chances to serve not just as a protection officer but as a caring adult in the lives of children who needed both security and genuine human connection. As he looked down the corridor toward the children's rooms, Marcus felt a deep sense of satisfaction and purpose.
His devotion had indeed been tested that night 6 months ago, tested in ways he could never have imagined. But the test had ultimately strengthened not just his own commitment to service, but the entire system of protection surrounding the royal family.
The lesson learned was one that would influence royal security practices for years to come. That true protection means safeguarding not just physical safety but emotional security as well. It means understanding that behind every title and protocol are real people with real needs, real fears, and real hopes for the future.
Prince George slept peacefully, his teddy bear beside him, secure in the knowledge that he was loved and protected by people who saw him not just as a future king but as a little boy who deserved kindness, understanding, and genuine care. And in the corridor outside his room, Marcus Thompson stood guard, knowing that this was exactly where he belonged, doing exactly what he was meant to do. The story that had begun with tears and uncertainty had become one of growth, understanding, and positive change. Marcus's devotion had been tested and proven, not just to his supervisors or to the royal family, but to himself. He had learned that sometimes the greatest act of service is simply being human when humanity is most needed. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the palace windows, Marcus prepared to end another successful night watch.
Soon, the children would wake to begin another day, safe and secure in the knowledge that they were protected by people who truly cared about them. And that, Marcus knew, was the greatest testament to the power of choosing compassion over protocol, heart over handbook, and human connection over rigid rules.
The guards' devotion had indeed been tested, and in the testing, everyone had discovered what true protection really meant.